Hello guys and welcome to my new video. So today I decided to have a look at the mythic race, and it seems to be very exciting. As I'm recording this video right now, Method has killed 10 mythic bosses, so only Argus the Unmaker is left for Method. Method is closely followed by Limit and Exorsus. I'm excited to see Limit as a US guild really pushing for the Mythic Plus race, and it's really cool to see America up in there in the top 3. So I decided to have a look at the breakdown of the healers, of the tanks, and of the DPS that the 3 of the guilds use, because it's kind of between the top 3 guilds right now. They're 9 or 10 out of 11, followed by other guild. The closest other guild is like 7 out of 11. So I'm going to be looking at the top 1% and looking at their raid compositions, because they really did put a lot of effort into deciding which classes to use, which tanks to use, which healers are the best, how many healers to bring, how many DPS to bring, and things like that. So I've looked at all of their compositions. I made this little video, a breakdown of the classes they use. Keep in mind that this only affects 0.001% of the population. I'm looking only at 3 guilds and looking at the compositions that they made. Keep it, like I said, keep in mind again, it only affects them. It does not mean if you don't see your class there, they're like, oh my god, Arms Warriors. For example, there was not a single Arms Warrior used in Progression Raid, and if you're playing Arms Warrior right now, you're like, oh, maybe Arms Warriors are terrible. No, it does not affect you unless you're in Method, Limit, or Exorsus. It really, or top 100 guild, or top 200 guild, or top 300 guild. It doesn't really affect you, but it's interesting to see the composition that they used. So in terms of tanking, we saw a decent breakdown of a lot of tanks being used. Big surprise, Vengeance Demon Hunters, not a single one used. Does it mean that they're crap? For progression, yeah. For progression, it does mean that they're crap. For anyone else out there, they're a very valid choice, but not a single Vengeance Demon Hunter was used. Exorsus, well, actually a lot of guilds opted in to use combinations of tanks. For certain fights they went in with like 2 blood DKs, or for other fights they went in to things like 2 Brewmaster monks. Overall, Brewmasters were a very strong pick. A lot of guilds actually went with 1 or 2 for a lot of the fights. Guardian Druids and blood DKs were a good composition pick. They were used by a lot of the guilds early in the progression, and then later on as well. There was a lot of fights where they used 2 blood DKs, 2 Brewmaster monks, 1 Guardian Druid and Brewmaster monk. There was a good nice spread of these tanking classes. Now, only Exorsus actually ended up using 2 Protection Paladins, and that was for Varimatras and Covenant, and that was the only instances where we saw Protection Paladins being used. And there were only very few instances of Protection Warriors being used. I know that Limit ended up using them for Varimatras and Covenant. And so basically Protection Paladins and Protection Warriors, there was not a lot of them, but they were used in one of the harder fights. So it's still nice to see that there's a different combination of tanks being used for certain fights. And you can see that all of them are quite viable except for Vengeance Demon Hunters. Maybe Protection Paladins, there was not many of them, but we have, for example, for Mythic Aggramar kill, Method actually opted in to use 2 blood DKs, and there was quite a few fights where a lot of people went with 2 blood DKs as well. So like I said, Brewmaster monks, Guardian Druids, and blood DKs were seen a lot. They were used by a lot of the top end Mythic raiding guilds. Protection Paladins and Protection Warriors were more of a niche pick. It seemed to be more of a niche pick that they used for certain fights. Like for example, Method didn't really use a Protection Warrior or a Protection Paladin for any of the fights. So that's to be... They stuck with their own kind of a makeup of Guardian Druid, Blood Decay, or Brewmaster Monk. So that's the composition of the tanks. In terms of healers, there was a good, nice composition, a lot of healers being used. I know Method stuck with their combination of Holy Paladin, Resto Druid, Disc Priest, and Resto Shaman for a lot of the fights. It was really nice to see Limit actually using a Mistweaver Monk for a lot of the progression. Mistweaver Monk was actually in terms of healers, Limit end up being one of those guilds that under-healed majority of the fights. They actually 3-healed Fellhounds, Antorus High Command, Enar, Kingaroth, and Varimatras. Some of the guilds went with 5 healers for Varimatras, and Limit end up using 3 healers for it. And they actually end up going with the Restoration Druid, Mistweaver Monk, and a Discipline Priest, which was really, really interesting to see. So you saw a lot of different combinations of healers. Not a lot of guilds end up stacking healers. It was interesting to see the Holy Priest. The only instance of a Holy Priest ever being used by these 3 guilds was by Method in Mythic Agromag Hill. That was the only time you saw a Holy Priest being used. Maybe it's because of how their tier 21 turned out, but definitely Holy Priest was not a preferred option for progression guilds for Antorus. Now, Enar was the only fight where 3 of the guilds used 5 healers. It was the only fight where all of the 3 guilds end up using 5 healers. And it seems to be that the general consensus for a lot of these guilds was that if we're going to 5 heal, or if we're going to add an additional healer to a certain fight, we're going to go with 2 Restoration Shamans. And that was a lot for a lot of the cases. There was quite a few fights where 2 Restoration Shamans were used by a lot of the guilds. There was one exception where Limit for Covenant ended up using 2 Restoration Druids, and that was the only fight by these 3 guilds that I saw 2 Restoration Druids being used. Overall, it was usually 1 healer per class. And other than that, there were quite a few fights with the 2 Restoration Shamans being used, like I said. It was also really interesting to see that the Highfather's Machination trinket that drops from Covenant was used by a lot of the healers, especially in Exorsus. There were like, at some cases, three of the healers were using Highfather's Machination trinket. So arguably this is going to be a very good progression trinket for healers and something worth to pick up for your guild or for your healer. So that was very, very interesting. Now, let's move on to the DPS. And the DPS was very, very interesting. There's quite a lot of class stacking happening. Now, based from the ranged and melee splits, there was really quite a split between range and melee for a lot of the fights. Of course, not for Covenant of Shivaris, because that is a super melee-friendly fight. And there were literally none of the guilds. All of the guilds opted in to use as minimal amount of melee as possible. I think Exorsus ended up going with 3 or something, which was the maximum. I think most of the guilds ended up going with 1 or 0 melee. They just went in with massive spread AoE multi-dotters like Shadow Priest, Affliction Warlocks, Balance Druids. They were really, really, really strong for Covenant. Now, like I said, let's look at the melee breakdown. So for melee, the majority of classes or specs that were used were Rogues and Fury Warriors. That was the basic setup. There were few Retribution Paladin, like 1 Retribution Paladin per guild on some fights, but it was mainly either 2 or 3 sub-rogues with some mixture of assassination rogues. There were no outlaw rogues that I saw. So it was basically, on some fights there were 3 sub-rogues, maybe 2 sub-rogues and 1 assassination rogue. And for a lot of the fights there were 2 Fury Warriors. A lot of the guilds actually end up going with 2 Fury Warriors. There was not a single, from what I've seen, there was not a single Arms Warrior in the progression race for the 3 guilds. Does that mean Arms is dead? It doesn't. It does not affect you. It's interesting to see, but it does not affect you unless in your top guilds. So like I said, quite a few Fury Warriors, quite a few Rogues as well. In terms of ranged, there was quite a bigger balance, but the majority of the guilds, like for example, Exorsus was the only guild that actually ended up going with like 3 Frost Mages for a lot of the fights. There were quite a few Frost Mages, but there were not 3 Frost Mages for a lot of the fights. Exorsus ended up going with that kind of setup. Most of the guilds end up, like Limit went crazy and just stacked Affliction Warlocks and Marksmanship Hunters, and to some extent Balance Druids for a lot of the fights. Like there were some fights where there was like 5 Marksmanship Hunters. Overall, but looking at the range DPS, Marksmanship was stacked like crazy. There was a lot of Marksmanship Hunters by 3 of the guilds used for a lot of the fights. AoE and single target fights, which is really interesting to see. A lot of Affliction Warlocks. There was Affliction, even though Affliction got nerfed, Affliction is looking extremely strong. There was a lot of Balance Druids used, especially for all of the AoE fights. And There were 2 or 3 balance druids used by a lot of the guilds. There were quite a few shadow priests and quite a few frost mages. Now, I've looked at some of the fire mages, and there were 1 or 2 fire mages, but it seemed to be that the general consensus was that if it's an AoE fight, we're gonna bring a balance druid, an affliction warlock, marksmanship hunter instead of a fire mage. And if we need a single target DPS, we're gonna bring like a sully rogue and a frost mage that's going to provide a really good single target. Overall, range DPS, affliction, marksmanship, balance, shadow priests were one of the classes that were just heavily stacked. And in terms of melee, warriors and rogues were the most prominent classes that were used by a lot of these guilds in this progression race. So this has been my breakdown of the DPS, the healers and the tanks that were used in the mythic race. It's really interesting to see what combinations these guilds end up using, because they did put in a lot of effort into finding the best classes for the best fights. Of course, you have to remember that sometimes they don't have backups, but I mean, they do have like 5 alts each. But it's really interesting to see that multi-daughters were really strong. It was interesting to see that in terms of healers, holy priests were not used. I could say holy priests were not used. In terms of tanking, vengeance demon hunters they were not there for progression. In terms of every other tanks, like brewmasters, guardians, DKs were dominating. And then you had niche picks in terms of warriors and protection paladins. So let me know how you feel about these guilds. Let me know how you feel about 10 bosses being killed already and only 1 boss left. Personally, I don't mind at all. If the whole instance gets cleared in 1 week, why does it really matter? Most of the guilds, 99% of the population are going to take months and months to actually get to that point. It's sad to see an instance getting cleared in 1 week, but it doesn't affect it. I mean, if Method finds a particular boss hard, that boss is probably going to be impossible for everyone else. So I don't want to see the Tomb of Sargeras where there were 3 bosses that were super hard and they were considered guild killers, because no guild, no ordinary guild, no ordinary mythic guild wanted to wipe 400 times on a boss and then wipe again 400 times on a boss and then wipe again 400 times on a boss. So I am upset to see raid instance being cleared this fast, but I'm also kind of happy in the same way. So I'm contradicting myself with this. But let me know how you feel about this video. Let me know how you feel about the breakdown of the DPS classes, and I'll see you next time.